I never expected my life to get weirder at 9 in the morning. Not in a calm, let's get coffee kind of way, but in a way that made me question all the tiny decisions that led me here. And yet, there I was, leaning against the doorway of the office, watching her. She was standing by the large floor-to-ceiling window, hands clasped behind her back, gazing out at the rainy street like she had all the time in the world. Her heels clicked softly against the polished wood as she turned, and for a second, the world seemed to pause. I couldn't tell if it was the way she carried herself, or the quiet weight of someone who had lived more years than you could count, but still moved through the room as if she owned it, and yet owed nothing to anyone. Mere boss in Kaha. My phone buzzed with a reminder to call her, but I couldn't bring myself to move. She was looking at me now, not in a judging way, not exactly, but like she'd noticed I existed in the smallest, unnoticed corners of her world. And somehow, that was enough to make my palms sweat. I tried to focus on the task I'd come for. Paperwork, schedules, the usual mundane things. But she was a storm in the room. She leaned over my shoulder, pointing at a document, and I caught the faint scent of her perfume, something floral but grounded, like rain hitting pavement. I swallowed and nodded, pretending to read, though my eyes kept slipping to hers. Her expression flickered, half amusement, half something I couldn't name, and it made my chest tighten in a way I wasn't ready to analyze. "Are you always this distracted?" she asked, voice low, smooth, casual, but threaded with a tease I wasn't sure I deserved. I blinked. Did she know? Could she see it in my eyes? Sometimes," I muttered, catching a faint smile that didn't quite reach the edges of her eyes. She pulled back, a faint crease forming between her brows, and turned to her desk like nothing had happened. And just like that, the moment vanished, but it left a residue, like smoke curling around my thoughts. She had this way of moving that made ordinary gestures, pouring coffee, tucking her hair behind her ear, scanning papers, looked deliberate and effortless at once. I watched her adjust a stack of files, hands lingering over the edges for a moment longer than necessary, and I realized my heart was doing something ridiculous. Skipping, hammering, begging me to notice the way she existed in a room I'd never thought would matter to me. And then, the smallest act. She noticed I'd left my umbrella outside in the rain, and without a word, she grabbed it, shaking off the drops, and handed it to me. Our fingers brushed for the briefest instant, and I wanted to memorize that touch. The warmth, the faint tremor, the electric insistence that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't supposed to be this still, this quiet, this full of unspoken currents. I left the office that morning soaked from the drizzle, umbrella forgotten in my hand, heart still stuck somewhere between guilt and fascination. Every detail of her lingered, the tilt of her chin, the precise way she exhaled when concentrating, the subtle, teasing light in her eyes. And I couldn't stop thinking about the look she gave me as I walked out, a look that said nothing but promised everything. I didn't know it then, but something had sparked. Something unspoken, fragile, impossible to name. And I already knew I would be chasing it long before I understood why. I didn't expect to see her again so soon. But life, apparently, has a sense of humor. The next morning, I found myself in the office again, clutching a stack of files she'd asked me to organize. The rain had stopped, leaving a faint, damp chill that clung to the windows and made the room smell faintly of wet cement and coffee. She was at her desk when I arrived, sleeves rolled up, hair tied loosely, glasses perched at the end of her nose. I thought for a second she looked smaller that way, softer somehow, as if the armor she wore around the office had slipped just enough to reveal the edges underneath. "Here," I said, offering the files. She didn't look up immediately. Her fingers hovered over a pen, then tapped it absent-mindedly against the desk. I noticed the slight tremor, just enough to make me pause, and the faint dark circles under her eyes, a detail no one else would notice, no one else would care about. "Thanks," she murmured, voice tight but polite. She stacked the papers slowly, deliberately. There was a pause, the kind of pause that makes ordinary sounds, shuffling paper, distant traffic, the hum of a copier, feel magnified, as if the room itself were holding its breath. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension. But I didn't. I was learning that with her, silence wasn't emptiness. It was charged. Dangerous, in a way I didn't know how to handle. You look tired, I said finally, almost muttering it. Not a question, not an observation meant to start a conversation. Just a small truth. Her eyes flicked up to me, sharp, assessing, and for a fraction of a second, I thought I'd overstepped. But then she exhaled slowly, shoulders dropping just slightly, and that was enough. She tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, avoided my gaze, and whispered, "It's been a long week." And there it was, vulnerability, tucked inside a sentence so ordinary it might have been overlooked by anyone else. I noticed her fingers twisting a paperclip between them, the faint tap of a ring against the desk, the way her shoulders tensed before releasing. Each micro-movement spoke volumes, though she tried to hide it all behind calm, measured motions. I stepped closer to help with the files, pretending it was casual. My hand brushed hers briefly, and I felt a spark, small, almost absurd, but unmistakable. She didn't pull away, not fully, but the tension in her posture told me she was aware, that she was guarding herself, keeping me at a distance, yet unable to ignore the smallest threads of connection stretching between us. And then she laughed, a low, soft sound, almost a sigh, when a file slipped from my hands and we bent down together to catch it. It was the kind of laugh that didn't erase the tension, didn't make the moment safe, it just made it more dangerous, more electric. I stepped back, letting her straighten, but I couldn't stop noticing the faint flush on her cheeks, the slight quiver in her hands as she rearranged the papers. I wanted to reach out again, to test the line she had drawn, but I didn't. Instead, I stood there, silent, feeling the pull of something forbidden and utterly irresistible. And as she finally returned to her work, eyes focused on a spreadsheet, I realized I was already thinking about her hands, her laugh, the tiny tremor in her fingers, and how every small, guarded detail made it impossible to look away. The rain returned that evening, hammering against the windows in a rhythm that made the office feel smaller, more intimate than it had any right to. I was there late, sorting invoices she had asked me to check, the hum of the overhead lights low, the shadows long across the floor. She was sitting across from me, leaning slightly forward, elbows on the desk, eyes tracing numbers and notes with a concentration that made her jaw line sharper, more vulnerable at the same time. I caught myself staring, not in a creepy way, I told myself, but noticing the small details, the curl of hair that had escaped her bun, the faint rise and fall of her chest, the way her fingers flexed against the pen, as if every motion required effort. My chest ached with a pull I couldn't name, a quiet longing that made each second with her heavier than it had to be. "Do you need a hand with that?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my voice came out lower than intended. She glanced up, eyes meeting mine for longer than comfort allowed, then flicked away as if she hadn't noticed anything at all. "I've got it," she said softly, but there was something in the hesitation, the way her lips pressed together, that told me she didn't entirely believe her own words. We worked in silence, the kind of silence that is nearly impossible to ignore. At one point, our hands brushed as we reached for the same folder, and I froze, aware of the small electric jolt that ran through me. She didn't pull away, just paused, eyes darting to my face and then back to her work, and I realized we were both acutely aware of the space we were sharing. Too close, but not close enough. Then her phone buzzed on the desk. She glanced at it, stiffening. A text from an old friend, or maybe someone she'd rather forget. I didn't ask. I just watched the way her fingers trembled slightly as she swiped to reply, the faint bite of her lower lip that betrayed irritation, uncertainty, and something else I couldn't name. I wanted to reach across, brush it away, make her laugh, make it easier somehow. But I didn't. I sat there, heart hammering, fingers curling around the edge of the folder, conscious of the tension pressing in from every direction. The storm outside, the office rules, her guarded posture, my own restraint. Minutes passed. Words seemed impossible. The rain drummed faster against the windows, drowning the quiet sighs and shuffles, and I realized how close we were sitting. Close enough to feel the heat from her shoulder. Close enough that if I leaned slightly, if I didn't think, if I let instinct take over. But I didn't. She stood suddenly, reaching for her coat. My hand itched to stop her, to say something. Anything that might make this easier or harder or unforgettable. Instead, I watched her gather her things, every movement deliberate, controlled, untouchable. The storm outside mirrored the storm in my chest, and I realized that this unspoken, unclaimed tension was as sharp as any confession could ever be. As she opened the door to leave, she paused, looking back over her shoulder, eyes flicking to mine, lips twitching as if she had something to say, but didn't. That almost smile, almost word, almost touch, lingered in the room long after she was gone, and I stayed frozen, heart tangled in everything left unsaid. It was late again. The office was nearly empty, except for the hum of the air conditioner and the faint glow of the streetlights casting long rectangles across the floor. I had been stacking files for the better part of an hour, pretending that organization could somehow make sense of the chaos between us. She appeared at the doorway quietly, a shadow framed by dim light. I didn't turn immediately. I wanted to, desperately, but something held me back, some unspoken rule I couldn't name. "Hey," she said softly, voice catching somewhere between tired and fragile. She leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, eyes dark under the exhaustion. "Can we talk?" I nodded, wordless. She walked past me, and the air seemed to tighten around us. We didn't sit, didn't move closer. We just existed in the same narrow corridor of light and shadow, the silence stretching like a living thing. Finally, she spoke again. "I don't know what this is anymore," she said, words measured, but trembling at the edges. "I mean us, this whatever we're doing here. It's not normal." My throat tightened. I wanted to apologize, to deny, to explain, but none of it made sense. The files I held suddenly felt absurd, meaningless. I just nodded, swallowing hard. She laughed, a short, bitter sound, and it made my stomach twist. "I see the way you look at me," she admitted, not quite meeting my eyes. "And God, I see the way I look at you. But this isn't supposed to happen. Not with you. Not with me. Not like this." Her hands twisted at her sides, small tremors in the fingertips I had memorized without even realizing. I wanted to reach out, wanted to touch her hands, smooth the tension from her shoulders, but the moment was too fragile, too charged. One wrong move, one careless word, and everything could shatter. I don't know what I want," she whispered. The words hit me like ice water. They weren't romantic, they weren't sweet. They were desperate, real, human. And somehow, that made the pull even more unbearable. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. What could I say? That I was equally lost. That I wanted to reach for her and simultaneously crawl away? That every thought of her left me trembling and breathless? None of it seemed right. She stepped closer, just a fraction, and I noticed how the light caught the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, how the shadow of worry softened her sharp jaw. For a moment, our shoulders nearly touched. The space between us felt impossibly small, electric, impossible to ignore. And then she said it. Not a confession, not a challenge, not a tease, just a single, devastating line that left the air thick and unsteady. "Maybe we shouldn't exist in the same room anymore." She didn't wait for a response. She turned, walking toward the exit, coat slipping from her shoulder, hair catching the light like fire. I stood frozen, fingers clenched, heart pounding, every instinct screaming to follow and to stay, all at the same time. The silence she left behind wasn't empty. It was full of questions, tension, longing, confusion, and it followed me long after the door clicked shut. I wasn't expecting her to call me. Not after the last night. Not after the tension that had stretched itself into something almost unbearable. Yet there was her name lighting up my phone, small letters against the dark screen. "Can we meet?" she asked, voice low, almost careful, as if speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile air between us. I agreed. We ended up in the small cafe a few blocks from the office, the kind with warm yellow lights that made everything softer, quieter, more intimate without trying. She arrived first, sliding into the booth, jacket damp from the drizzle outside. Her eyes, always so composed in the office, looked heavier today, tired in a way that went beyond a long week. I didn't tell you everything, she said, stirring her coffee absently. The spoon clinked against the cup, a fragile punctuation to her words. About me. About why I am cautious. Why I keep everything at arm's length. I leaned forward, hesitant. I didn't need her to explain, but the raw honesty in her voice made me sit still and listen, because whatever she said next mattered. There was someone, she murmured, eyes focused somewhere on the table, maybe tracing old scars in the wood. A long time ago. Someone I let go, or maybe he let me go. Doesn't matter. But I've carried it with me, and it's why I can't just fall into things. Her fingers traced the rim of her cup, a slow, deliberate gesture, as if holding on to something tangible could keep the memories from spilling out completely. I wanted to say something comforting, but words felt clumsy, heavy, so I just listened. I noticed how her shoulders rose slightly when she exhaled, the tiny crease at the corner of her mouth that appeared when she tried not to cry, the way her voice faltered ever so slightly when she admitted the truth. Sometimes I think about what it would be like if things had been different, she continued, voice barely above a whisper. If I hadn't lost him. If I hadn't been too proud, too stubborn, too afraid. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clatter of a dish. I reached across the table without thinking, resting my hand near hers. Not touching, just near, a silent acknowledgement that I was here, that I wasn't going anywhere. She glanced down, fingers brushing against mine almost by accident, and I saw a flicker in her eyes, surprise, hesitation, relief, all tangled together. And then she looked up, meeting my gaze fully for the first time since we sat down. There was no playfulness, no teasing, just honesty, raw and unguarded. Thank you, she whispered, for noticing, for not turning away. I didn't know what to say. My heart was loud, my chest tight, every instinct shouting to close the distance. But I stayed still, letting the silence stretch, letting her words sink in. And then she smiled just slightly, a small curve of lips, fragile, hesitant, but enough. Enough to make my entire body ache, enough to make the world feel unsteady in the most wonderful way. That smile lingered in my mind long after she left, and I realized something terrifying and exhilarating. I was no longer just observing her. I was carrying pieces of her with me, and I didn't want to put them down. The office was empty again, but it didn't feel like before. Not tense, not charged in that sharp, unbearable way. It was quieter, softer, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. She was at her desk, sorting papers with her usual precision, but there was a calm in her movements today, a subtle rhythm that spoke of trust one hadn't earned yet. I stayed near the doorway for a moment, watching her. There were still traces of the storm in her eyes, the faint tension in her shoulders, but now they felt like gentle ripples rather than warning signs. And I realized, maybe for the first time, that I didn't want the tension to break. I wanted to be here, in the stillness, in the quiet gravity of her presence. She looked up, eyes meeting mine across the room. No teasing this time. No careful distance. Just recognition. I took a step closer, and the gap between us didn't feel like danger anymore. It felt inevitable. You stayed late again, she said, voice low, almost conversational, but threaded with something warmer. I shrugged, letting the words hang between us without explanation. She laughed softly, and I noticed the way her shoulders relaxed, how the faint crease at the corner of her mouth deepened. You always do, she said, a statement, not a question. Even when I tell you not to. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Instead, I sat across from her, a small distance, just enough to reach if necessary. We worked in silence for a few moments, our movements parallel, like two halves of a conversation neither of us could speak aloud. Then, almost unconsciously, our hands brushed. Not dramatic, not rehearsed. A fingertip against a fingertip, a small acknowledgement that we had been orbiting each other for months. She didn't pull away. I didn't move closer. We just let it linger, and in that tiny, delicate connection, the entire unspoken truth settled into the space between us. I, I think I understand now, she whispered, eyes dropping to the table. Not about love, not exactly, but about the gravity of what had been building, about the inevitability of proximity, about the quiet permission we'd given each other just by existing in the same room. I nodded, and for a moment, words were useless. Just the soft brush of her hand against mine, the shared breath, the subtle exhale that made the tension release without force. We didn't need declarations. There was no dramatic confession, no fireworks, just the simple, steady acknowledgement that we belonged here, together in a way that had grown slowly, painfully, beautifully over time. The light from the window caught her hair, and I leaned slightly forward, letting my forehead rest lightly against hers. Not a kiss, not a gesture of possession, just a quiet settling, a mutual recognition that the walls we'd built around ourselves no longer mattered. She closed her eyes, and I felt the shift in her breath, slow and steady, a mirror of my own. The storm outside had passed. The storm within us had calmed. And in that silence, there was everything: understanding, patience, and a fragile but unbreakable connection that had been months in the making. We stayed like that for a long while. No words, no movement beyond the subtle warmth of contact. And for the first time, it felt like enough. It's strange, looking back now, how small moments can change everything. I remember the first day clearly. The rain, the quiet pause in the doorway, the way she had handed me that umbrella without a word. At the time, it felt like nothing. Now, I realize it was the first thread of something that would unravel and rebuild both of us in ways neither of us expected. We're different now. I'm quieter in some ways, more attentive, more patient with the pauses and silences that used to make me restless. I've learned to read the subtleties, the way her fingers linger over the edge of a cup, the small gestures that tell me more than words ever could. I notice her not just in moments of intensity, but in the mundane. The way she organizes her desk, the faint hum she makes when she's focused, the softness in her voice when she thinks no one is listening. And she's different too. I can see it in the way she allows herself to pause, to lean into trust without fear. The edges that once seemed so guarded have softened, not vanished, but tempered with the understanding that connection doesn't have to be frightening. We've both carried the weight of past heartbreaks, mistakes, and missed opportunities, but now those things don't feel like chains. They're reminders that love can grow slowly, carefully, and still be real. I've realized that love isn't always fireworks and grand gestures. Sometimes it's the brush of fingers over a folder, the quiet acknowledgement of presence, the shared silence after a storm passes. It's noticing someone, truly noticing, and allowing them to notice you in return. It's letting small, fragile moments accumulate into something undeniable. And what we have isn't perfect. It's messy, it's human, it's slow, but it's ours. We've learned to inhabit the spaces between words, to honor pauses, to let vulnerability speak without fear of judgment. We've learned that love isn't always declared. Sometimes it's simply lived, moment by moment, touch by touch, glance by glance. I catch myself smiling sometimes for no reason at all, remembering a small laugh, a fleeting brush of hands, a storm that stopped outside but raged inside for weeks. And I think she feels it too, in her quiet ways, because sometimes she catches my gaze, holds it a second longer, and it says everything words never could. Looking back, I realize the greatest part of this story isn't the tension, or the hesitation, or even the nearly missed opportunities. It's the patience we gave each other, the permission to be flawed, hesitant, afraid, and still somehow present. The acknowledgement that connection doesn't need to be rushed, it needs to be understood. We're here now, still cautious in some ways, still learning, still savoring the slow burn that brought us together. And in that quiet, I think we've found the thing that lasts. Not perfection, not drama, not fireworks, but the steady, grounded certainty that comes when two people finally stop running from what they've been waiting for all along. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?